This is the Art of Imperfect Adulting. I'm your host, Amy Stone. I share stories from real people who have already been through some hard stuff. Why? So that you don't feel alone while you're busy figuring out your own life. Let's do this. Hello, friends. It's Amy, and I am going to introduce you to Elicia Ybarra today. We're going to talk about some fun stuff and some serious stuff. Elicia, welcome to the Art of Imperfect Adulting. I start all of my interviews and my conversations with the same question. What part of the world do you call home? It's a hidden second part and something you love about living there.
Hi, Amy. Thank you so much for having me. I know we've been trying to get this going for a little bit, so I'm really excited to be on your show today. I am from Southern California. I live right outside Los Angeles, and although there's a lot of things not to like, one of the things I do love is the weather and being so close to the beach. I'm about 20 minutes from a few different beaches, so it's nice to be able to just go and put my feet in the sand and relax.
That is a fantastic thing to love about it. It's one of the most popular places in the world. All right. Now, the next one is this is like a get to know you question. It's not a perfect question. It was probably a little older than you. I was raised with that old thing where we're not supposed to ask people how old they are. So I sneak around to it and I ask people which generational description matches you: silent generation, baby boomer, Gen X, millennial, or Gen Z.
I am a millennial.
Love it, love it, love it, love it. All right, very good. Now that we know each other oh so well, let's get to the topic today. We're going to talk about safety, feeling safe, and training to be safe, and all of those things. And before we get to the meat of this story and why you share it and why it's something that we're going to talk about, I want to back up and rewind the clock a little bit. You shared with me in your intake form that you grew up in martial arts or doing martial arts. Would love to give you a chance to tell me some more about what that means and about it.
Absolutely. So I grew up in the 90s. I'm a millennial. And I was really into Bruce Lee, Chuck Norris, Jean-Claude Van Damme, the Three Ninjas, the Ninja Turtles. Like those were my obsessions. I have two older brothers, so I wasn't really into the girly aspect of young life. And my parents in they put me in my first school at 6 years old. So I don't know why I had to think of that, but it was there. At six, it was like 1995, I believe, and it was a time where girls really didn't do a lot of martial arts, and if they did, it was because their brothers did it. And my first day, I became obsessed. I was like, I know what I want to do for the rest of my life. If I can't go to Japan and train to 20 years to be a ninja, I can be a martial arts instructor. And so I continued to build onto that for going on 30 years now. So it's been about 31, as a matter of fact, this year. I've earned a fourth Dan black belt in Taekwondo, a first Dan black belt in Hapkido. I've trained in many different styles. I've taught martial arts professionally. So for me, martial arts wasn't just kind of a hobby, it was very much a career path and a lifestyle.
Okay, so, but did it start when you were 6 years old? Is that what I heard?
Yeah, I started at 6 years old. It was my sixth birthday, as a matter of fact, when I did my first class.
Sixth birthday. It was a birthday present. You did a class. So did you come up with it based on like you saw something and you were like, I would like to do that? Or is this something that your parents or your siblings introduced to you? Like, tell me more about how you found it.
I was obsessed with the Ninja Turtles
The ninja.
and I wanted to be a ninja. And so
Okay.
I told my dad for my birthday I wanted to go train to be a ninja. And I lived in a small town in Northern California. The closest I could get to ninjutsu training was Taekwondo in my small town. And that's why I enrolled. But it was all my idea. And my parents say I started asking around 4 years old to start martial arts.
That is really interesting. All right, so that's very good. Taekwondo, I think, is a very common entry point for young kids. And so, because I am not a martial expert, but I have been through some Taekwondo classes with my kids. And that's why I have that thought. What Taekwondo is, tell us some of the differences between some of the modalities of martial arts, because my understanding is that Taekwondo is actually quite different from some others that people might hear about.
Yeah, absolutely. So Taekwondo is Korean, and a lot of it is was created by farmers years and years ago, in order to protect their farmland. So a lot of the weapons that you use in Taekwondo are actually modified farm tools.
Oh, I did not know that.
So yeah, and really, in the Western society, Taekwondo has been very much watered down in order to kind of be for the masses, right? Little kids, they don't want to start with a white belt and then train for, 5 to 7 years until that white belt turns black. They want to get different colors. That's why, they break up the curriculum the way that they do in Taekwondo. It is very, very similar to karate, which is Japanese.
Okay.
Um, the stances are different. The sparring style, which is just fighting, is a little bit different. Tournaments are different, but technically, I have a black belt in karate, and then I transferred over to Taekwondo because they were so similar
Oh,
in state. When you're looking at something like Kung Fu or even Krav Maga, these are all just different styles. Krav Maga is very militant, so it was created for the military.
okay.
Hapkido is also very militant. Taekwondo is more of a sport, especially in the United States. It's more considered a sport. It's one of the reasons it's in the Olympics. Hapkido, on the other hand, is more of like, let me use my leverage, break your bones, and really injure you heavily, which is one of the reasons that Taekwondo is much easier to teach to young children because I always say it's kind of like the entryway. It teaches a child how to learn martial arts in a very safe environment for them to do so.
Yeah, I'm gonna. It's been a long time, so tell me if I use the wrong words. But it's like the taekwondo that my littles did was very much about forms,
Mhm.
like and the practicing of the movement, and the sparring was almost like games. Very
Yeah.
supervised and about, but a really well designed, reward system. I mean, I had positive experience as a parent with it. Okay, so you were very young when you found this. You've done several different types of this. So Hapkido, I'd never heard of that. How do you spell that?
Hapkdo. Hold on, let me
Okay.
check my black. Hold on. I'm like, I have it up here somewhere. Yeah, Hapkido.
Hapkido. All right. Yeah, that one I had not heard of. All right. So then this was your choice. It was something you chose. You began as a kid. Was it mostly lessons and working your way up for the belts? Did you compete? What kind of did where did it change from 4 to 6 years old and following it for 30 years?
Um, because I started so young, I was able to get into competitions. I was part of the demonstration team, which is usually when local team members go out and they do things at like the local fair, a street
Yes.
fair, right? You'll see the kids up on stage doing,
Breaking the
mock
board.
sparring and fighting, right? Forms. So I was a big part of that. I was also very big into competitions. I started competitions right around 9 years old. And then I did them for about 10 years. I went from the karate style, which essentially is just a different type of sparring, to the Olympic style, which is actually Taekwondo style. Karate style, you really break up the fight. So every time I would score a point, they would stop the fight, they would give me a point. Taekwondo style, it's continuous. They just count the points up during the match, which is the easiest way to explain the difference. I was heavily into competitions for several years. I won my first belt championship at 11 years old, right before I earned my black belt. And then I went into weapons and I really became very just obsessed with the lifestyle of being a martial artist. And I knew from a very young age that I wanted to be an instructor. So I began doing the assistant teaching program at around 11 years old, right as I hit, I think, red belts. And then once I earned my black belt, I was able to barter my tuition for teaching. And so then it became basically a part-time job. I was around 13 years old at that time.
So you knew that you loved this enough that you wanted to do it forever, and it became a part of your identity. What were some of the things that you associate with the identity that you found soothing or supportive? Like, tell us more about what was it that resonated with you in this So for some people, it's a hobby. For you, it became part of your identity. What were some of the things that pulled you in to want to be deeper in the culture?
Um, Really, it was feeling like I was in control. I grew up in a very chaotic household as a young child. There was addiction. I had two older brothers who were also dealt with addiction. So, trigger warning, I'm talking about that. And martial arts became my escape.
Okay.
Like, that was the point where I could control my surroundings, I could control what was happening. And I really felt a deep sense of relaxation, control, and kind of humility when I was in the classroom. You know, I could just be myself. For a long time, my nickname was Ninja. Growing up, I was that one karate girl for a long time, all through high school. That's how people knew me. Most of them didn't even know my name, and we all grew up together. And so it was something that not only did I excel at, but I was good enough to keep trying. And I knew that all I had to do was work harder and I would be better. You know, there's some people that have like innate skills of the piano or they pick up a guitar and they play incredibly. I was not gifted with any type of innate skills like that. But with martial arts, I could keep practicing. I could try harder. I could go and practice more. And so it really became my safe space and my escape from the chaos of the childhood I had.
So I think that's really interesting. So you use the word control and you point out that there was chaos. One of the things that the dojos or the teaching rooms for at least for the kids that are doing taekwondo, one of the things that is so like phenomenal about a well-run dojo as a parent watching is that it's so organized and there's such a concentrated, well done way of communicating to the young kids what is going to happen when and how they can advance or what the consequences will be if they don't follow the rules, kind of thing. Like everything is very clearly defined and explained. Does that align up with what you for you turned into being a place that was safe because it was so controlled and you could navigate safely in that space?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the
Yeah.
structure of the curriculum, I knew exactly what was happening 5 minutes into the class, 10
Yeah.
minutes. I found out later in life, in my 30s, that I actually was diagnosed with ADHD in my
Okay.
30s, like a lot of
Yeah.
women. And so now when I look back on that, I realize that really what I was craving was that routine and that structure. And I didn't have any of that in my home life. I was always kind of parentified at a young age, and I
Yeah.
was considered like, oh, you just need to know what to do. And so in martial arts, you learned what to do, and then you were able to build almost like a Lego set on over and over and build yourself up to understanding exactly what was going to happen. And so, like, it was just such a calm feeling to go in knowing my class started at 3:30, I was going to be done at 4:30, and then sparring card started at 4:45, and then I was going to be done at 6. Like, I knew that every day. And so I ended up training 4 to 6 days a week for several years.
All right, so that and the people who are listening to this who may not have a relationship with martial arts, this is actually something that I hear as an interviewer. I'm not an expert in this, but this, when you come from a place that's disorganized or chaotic, a lot of people do seek organized spaces, and that can show up in young kids being more comfortable at school. For me, it was running in a track environment. It can be the library. It can be, any one of those things. But martial arts is definitely, I can see why you would have loved that. All right. So as you start this as a child, you say there was chaos, and you love the identity of it. You step into the identity of it. You're passionate about it. You decide at a very young age that you want to do this forever and ever and ever. So let's talk a little bit about the relationship of, because different from the library or like a soccer team that might give somebody structure, martial arts is designed around combat and sometimes self-defense, right? Is that right? Yeah, self-defense or even, aggression. So let's talk about the relationship there. Like, did you feel as someone who was that karate girl, did you begin to develop a sense that you were safe because you had these skills, like safe in a teenage world, like in a high school world, in a street walking late at night, any of those things?
Oh, absolutely. I would say, arrogant in my thought process because I was already a champion fighter. I was one of the best fighters in my school, hands down, and I had already earned a black belt in that I had already trained in multiple different styles. And so the idea that somebody in high school was going to peer pressure me or make me do something I didn't want to do, or a boy was going to try to take advantage of me was, in my opinion, laughable at that time. I didn't feel like I was susceptible to brute force in that way. I felt like I was very confident in my ability to defend myself. What I wasn't prepared for was the manipulation of adults. And that's really, trigger warning for your listeners. That's really where I fell victim to a martial arts instructor that I very
Okay.
much admired. And I didn't understand how much boundaries and gut feelings and intuition played a role in our safety, especially for young teenagers. And so that made me susceptible. But when it came to my ability to physically defend myself, I was incredibly confident that if somebody tried to hurt me, attack me, assault me, that I would hurt them very badly.
Okay, so yeah, we're gonna make the jump here to the next part of the story, and I don't know the rest of this, and you just gave me a piece of it that I wasn't sure, but I wanted to clarify before we moved on that what we're going to talk about next, and this is me clarifying it for the audience. So if you're listening to this and you're in a car with a bunch of kids, I don't know why you would be listening to this particular show with a car full of kids, but if you are, we're going to talk about a situation. Would this qualify as something that people would consider domestic or violent, like partner violence? Is that how we're going to qualify this?
We would qualify this as grooming and probably statutory assaults.
Okay. All right. All right.
There wasn't any domestic violence parts
All
of it, but
right.
there very much was manipulation, coercion, and assault.
I get it. All right, I get it. So this is a situation then, which is you've got authority figures who are the instructors in the martial arts community, and you've got students that begin very young but go all the way up to young adults. Right? You can start martial arts as an adult, but there is a hierarchy of power. The instructors are authorities within the gym. How old were you when you would say that this began? Well, actually, let's back up. Let's go through this, right? Let's talk about a couple of things. You mentioned that this surprise that you had a lot of confidence. You felt very safe because you were very strong. You were very ready for physical combat. How did this sneak up on you? Like to walk us through, like what happened? What was the scenario, and why look how looking back do you think you missed it? Like this is a rear view window like analysis. You didn't notice it at the time.
Absolutely. And it's going to be a little bit long-winded, so bear with me, but I'll do my best to try to explain it in a kind of a chronological order. So, in martial arts, just a little context, right? You are often taught from a young age, especially when you start as a child, to push your uncomfortability aside in order to do what you're told by your master or your instructor. You are taught that they know better than you do. So, for context, that is what most children are being taught in a martial arts setting. And if it's not nefarious, it's actually usually very good. You can do five more push ups, your body can handle it, you got this, right? For me specifically, the grooming started when I was 13 years old. I had just earned my black belts. I was very confident. I was ready to take my competitions to the next stage. I had won everything on the small competition circuits I was on. And just so your listeners know, just like any other competition circuit, there's small ones and then they go all the way up to nationals and then you go to world. I was on this very small local circuits. I was ready to move up, so I decided to leave my first school and go to a new school where the instructor I had known for several years, my family was friends with his family. He was a national champion in the bow staff, which was what my favorite weapon is. So your listeners know it's basically a broomstick. It's just a
Okay.
long stick that you spin around. but you do competitions, you can spin it over your head. It was something I was very attached to. And this instructor was incredibly good at it. So I left my home school and then I went to his school. He had just opened, he was 21 at the time. I had a crush on him. I was, I think, 11 when I met him. I was 13 when I started training under him. And it began very slow. You know, we often talk about when we're talking about grooming that it doesn't happen all at once. There's trust that's gained. The child is groomed, but so are the adults around them. So his dad was my tournament coach. He was also best friends with my dad. So this wasn't some random coach, right? This was somebody that I knew very personally. And I trusted. I trusted to put my uncomfortability aside to do what he told me to do because I thought he had my best interests at heart. When I was 13, it was very innocent, at least what I had thought was innocent. He told me I was going to be very attractive when I was older. I was a pretty girl. I was going to be hot. Now looking back, that is a red flag that I absolutely missed. As a child, I was like, oh my God, this guy thinks I'm pretty and he's in his 20s. This is amazing. You
Right.
know, I'm
Right.
13 years old. I'm awkward. I don't really have a lot of friends at school. My whole life is around martial arts. And now this man that is a pillar in the community is telling me how pretty I am. So from 13 to about 15, there was no physical interaction. It was all just, you know, what I thought was very appropriate at the time. He would help me stretch. He would kind of hold me, like pick me up and hold me if I fell down. You know, he would help me do the splits and stretch me out by putting his legs in between my legs, which again, looking back in hindsight, huge red flag, grown man, 13-year-old girl. As a 13-year-old girl, this all felt very normal for me. It wasn't
Right.
something that I didn't consider. I was also often the only girl that was a black belt. So there wasn't anyone for me to compare the way that he was treating me to being inappropriate because he was doing the same thing with the boys.
Right. And let's pause here for a second and just talk about this because as I'm 52, right? From my perspective, when I think about a 13-year-old and a 21-year-old, that's a huge age gap. But I want to like just call out that I think that all of us can remember when we're younger having positive thoughts or crushes on people who are older than us. That's not an abnormal thing. And our concept of what's normal and appropriate is always defined by what we see around us. So, that's why I said in the beginning, I was like, this is looking back, because in the moment, you were going to practice and you were training for events, and this was your coach. And this was just one normal thing after another. How old were you when or if I should say if, because I actually don't know. How did it shift to where you were like, I'm not sure this is normal?
So when I turned 15, I was now staying at his house on the weekends with his parents. He lived with his parents, and I had my own room. And my parents weren't very comfortable with it, but because it was so far from our hometown, my parents couldn't afford the gas to take me back and forth 6 times a week. So they would take me the 3 days in the week, and then I would stay Friday through Sunday. And so that we could save a little bit of money. It was my coach, which was the instructor's dad, set me up with my own bedroom. It was never supposed to be where I was just having all of this alone time with this 21-year-old instructor. It slowly began to be that way as I got more comfortable staying at their house.
Okay.
When I was 15, they had a family party and I was up changing in my bathing suit and I had just changed and he came in and he told me how beautiful I was and he gave me my first real intimate romantic kiss.
Okay. That's a big shift in a
That was
relationship.
where it shifted.
So in your mind, like, I mean, this is a terrible question and you can tell me to bugger off, but as a young girl with a small social circle, like, do you remember this as being like, no, I would like to have a boyfriend and this guy is a great opportunity. Like, I like him, I respect him. Like, that seems normal at this time.
Yeah, absolutely. I
Okay.
mean, and I'm not going to tell you to bugger off at all. I think,
Okay.
you know, at 15 years old, he was 23 by that time. And I really kind of thought it was normal. Everybody in my life had always told me how responsible I was, how mature for my age I was, how I was an old soul. And I was never really hit on or approached by boys my age. From the time I was 11, 12 years old, I was always approached by grown men. So for me, it was very normalized that this man in his 20s was now seeing me as an adult and I was being treated like an adult. I had a job, I paid my own bills, I had my learner's permit. In my mind, it was a very equal leveled relationship. There was no power dynamics. He respected me. Looking back in the mirror, right? When now we're going to
Right.
the look back as a 30-year-old woman, a 37-year-old woman now, I'm like, oh, that was so inappropriate. And, you know, it was okay for the 15-year-old girl to have the crush. It was not okay for the 20-something-year-old man to react on that crush. And that's the way I
That's
teach.
that's the thing is, it's like every time I have one of these conversations, I think about, I'm like, I get why, like I totally understand why like an 18-year-old or a 19-year-old would go out on a date with somebody who's 23, 24 years old. Like I can understand that relationship. But now there's a lot of advantages. They hopefully have a job, they have more authority, they have, they open doors for the younger person. The older person looking for someone younger, that's the thing, and it relies on them being a better person for it not to happen, which is why it is such we talk about the power dynamic, like you were saying. Okay, so you are a young girl, you are growing up, you are enthusiastic about this. This feels exciting and new for you. You don't see the warning flags until you're much later. Is there a time in this relationship where you're like, wow, no, this is not right?
Yes, yes. There was a few times, especially when I talked to a couple of my close friends and they were like, you know, Ely, which is my nickname that I grew up with, you know, he's a little too old for you. And at the time, this instructor also had a long-term girlfriend.
Oh,
And
goodness.
so she lived in another town and what he had told me was they were on again, off again. I don't really know if they were
Maybe, yeah,
actually
sure.
together or not.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense in the story anyway. I was under the belief that he was single at the time. He actually ended up getting his long-term girlfriend pregnant and then
Mhm.
he proposed. And that was when for me it was like, okay, wait, this is something's wrong. And he explained it away in a way that I believed him. I 100% trusted him. He had said that they got engaged because if they weren't engaged and she was pregnant, her parents would disown her and that it would look bad on the school. So we were going to keep me and him a secret until the baby was born. And then once the baby was born, then I would be a little bit older and we could be together and I would help raise this man's baby. So he actually encouraged me at about 15 and a half, right before I turned 16, to develop a friendship with this now fiance, which I did because I thought that I was going to be like this stepmom
Yeah.
to this man's baby. I thought some way, and just so your listeners understand, it really goes to the immaturity of a 15 and a half year old to think that this was somehow going to be some big happy family of like the instructor marrying his student while still being kind of with his fiance.
Yeah.
Right, like there's an immaturity in that thought process that I recognize now. At the time, I was really like, "Oh, this is going to work out great, you know, like I'm going to be a mom." I was in the process of getting my GED so that I could drop out of high school when all of this kind of imploded. And it imploded shortly after the baby was born because the instructor had told me that if we wanted to be in an adult relationship, we needed to have sex.
Okay.
And so I had just turned 16 and I decided to have sex with him. Now, in my mind, this was consensual. This wasn't statutory rape in my mind at that age. It was consensual. I loved him and this was something I wanted to give to him. I thought this was the man I was going to marry.
Yeah.
So once we had intimate relations, once we had sex, I was like, I gave you what you wanted. The baby's born. The time's up. Now leave her.
Right.
You said you were going to. And he told me he did. And then the next day, she showed up with their apartment keys and she was all excited to tell me they had just gotten an apartment together. And that was when I realized that it was all bullshit. And excuse my language, but
No, it's
it was when like the fantasy bubble that there had been uncomfortability, there had been that intuitive feeling. I had felt like something was off. I had dismissed it under believing everything he was telling me, and now it was staring me in the face, the realistic aspects of what was truly happening to me. And it was then that his entire demeanor changed. Like he looked me directly in my face. He called me a slut. He told me that I had tempted and seduced him, and now I was throwing a tantrum like a child because I wasn't getting what I wanted. And that if I told anyone what happened between him and I, he would ruin my reputation in the martial arts industry. No adult male is going to want to train with a teenage girl who makes up stories about her instructor. He said it much more vulgarly, but I usually say it this way. I paraphrase it. And I walked away from that situation feeling like I was the problem. Like I was the person that made all of these bad decisions, that it was all my fault, and that I was better off never having contact or being a part of his life again. And what it really messed with was my identity at that time.
100%. 100%. I want to back up a little tiny bit because you talked about the immaturity of somebody at 13 and 15. And I just kind of want to back that up because for people who, I think that most people do have this experience, but we train our children to listen to the adults around them, right? So, like, if you walk into, one of the things that I've done in my past was taught both children and adults how to swim, right? You teach adults how to swim, you give them an assignment, and they have a million questions. They need to understand why, they need to understand how long it's going to take. They have all these questions. You're teaching children how to swim. You just tell them what to do and they just follow the instructions. They try and follow the instructions if they don't even understand. You will tell a room full of children to like go do the backstroke and like half of them won't do it because they don't understand the instructions, but they still try and follow it. So when you are in this situation and an adult is telling you what you're expected to do, even though it crossed the line, for me as an outsider, I can see exactly how that would be how you would follow the steps and not know that it was unusual until something showed up in front of you that you couldn't ignore. And I think that's important when we hear stories about things that other people do, that you don't have any signal. Like this was your coach. This was the person who you trusted for these things. So that it was just another set of instructions. And even though you had your eyes open, you were the young one in this situation. We rely on the adults who are with our children to have safeguards and standards in place. And so, but yeah, and then that goes on, right? That then when he tells you it's your fault, you've been trained to listen to him. So why wouldn't you believe it? Now, I'm going to ask you a question. Was there anybody in your world, in your family or your community outside the martial arts community that knew anything about this was going on? So your parents knew you were staying there as a matter of convenience, which is not all that unusual with advanced travel like sports, that there will be, that sort of, distance type thing. Most famous being, we all know about the girls who go and live in towns to be with tennis coaches and gymnastics coaches, right? So it's not super unusual. Did your family, you mentioned that your friends were like, he's pretty old. Was there anybody that you could go to and be like, I've been hurt?
Just my best friend, my
Okay.
my childhood best friend. Her name's Jessica. She's amazing. We're still friends to this day. She was the only one I really spoke to about it. Up until that point, all of the adults in my life really kind of, I would say, like they treated me like I was the problem in this situation. I did tell my coach, which was the instructor's dad, the one
Okay.
who had invited me to stay and gave me the room. And he broke down and he said he couldn't believe his son had done that. And then immediately after, he said, asked me if I could please not tell anyone because his son would go to jail and I would ruin his life. And so my thought
That's
was,
a
oh,
huge
okay.
amount of pressure to put on you.
And then when I told my parents after I turned 18, so I didn't tell them for a couple of years what had happened. And, my dad, he looked at me just with pure disappointment and told me that he had put all of this time, effort, energy, and money into me so that I could sleep with my instructor. And that was just pathetic. And that was his reaction to me. So it really wasn't until my 30s when I got therapy and I started to process through these things that happened at this young age that I realized that I was groomed and I was manipulated and I was abused by this man. But it was also all of the other adults around that were telling me, oh, your feelings are invalid because he's such a good guy. He's a pillar of the community. He's a great instructor. You must be looking into it too much. And it was really only my best friend that was saying, Ely, I wouldn't no, he has a fiance. Like, I don't care what he's telling you. Like, he's engaged to marry somebody else. Like, this is wrong. But at this time,
Yeah.
all of my few friends I did have, they were all also dating men in their 20s. So it wasn't just like this was abnormal in this small town. Most of the girls I knew were, and we saw it in the media, where you were supposed to go after the older guys. That's what meant that you were pretty and you were popular and you were attractive. It was when the older men were attracted to you, not when the boys your age were. And so I really had nobody, and there were no female instructors. So I had no one to actually look at and ask like, "Hey, is this normal? Is this the way to be treated?" Because I was the female instructor. I was the only black belt girl. So I had nobody. I was utterly alone in this healing process.
So but do you stay in this gym? Like you stay in,
No, I
okay.
left.
You left the gym, you stay in martial arts and
I
go
stayed
on,
in martial arts. I
but
left the gym.
you left the gym. So the choice you made to work like I mean there's a lot to unpack here. Like none of it as a reflection of you as a child and how you dealt with it because you succeeded. You put one foot in front of the other and you got to the point where you were strong enough to do the therapy. But it's a huge amount of pressure and a manipulation of power for an adult to hear a claim that somebody has hurt you and then ask you to keep it a secret because your health and safety is not as important as somebody else's job. I mean, like from a modern lens, like as an outsider, that's a weird thing. I totally understand. I can see, yes, that could have really harmed him, but that also is not this. That's not the same as you were a child who needed support and help. And so I'm very sorry that there was not an adult to stand with you and help you walk this path forward. One of the huge tragedies of like the modern human experience is that I'll just be honest, I've never heard of like a perfect solution to something like this because even if he had lost his job and even if he had gone to jail, it would not have undone what already happened. Right. Like, so it's not like that's actually an assistance for you it doesn't undo what has happened. You choose to stay in martial arts, you choose to change your gym. It sounds to me like you go on and just live your life for pretty close to a decade before this comes back up.
Yeah, so I moved out of my parents' house at 17 because of this, because my dad was so angry and he was so upset that he felt like I had thrown my future away. So I left. I moved out. I worked 3 jobs my senior year at high school, and then I landed my dream job down here in Southern California as a professional martial arts instructor right after I graduated high school. And then that actually leads into another abusive situation within the martial arts industry. So it turned out that the Grand Master that had hired me, he hired me because I was attractive to his son. And then he immediately hooked me up with his son. So I went from being a professional martial arts instructor to being the son's girlfriend. And I spent 3 years in a very highly controlled cult-like environment under an incredibly narcissistic and abusive grandmaster who now was even bigger within the community of martial artists and in the community in general as a pillar. And he really he abused me in a different way, not in any sexual manner. It was very much reprimand, emotional and mental abuse, under the guise of mentorship. Everything that he was saying, and when he would reprimand me, he wouldn't just reprimand me for like things I did wrong. He would reprimand me for things all the other instructors did wrong too, and he would humiliate me for their mistakes in front of them. And I was
Hmm.
again the only female instructor. I was the only girl. And now I'm engaged. I'm dating the boss's son. And so it was an incredibly toxic environment full of very much all loyal to him people in my life. I was again alone. And I'm down 6 hours away from my family. And I am being told that I was never going to hit the finish line, right? I'm given all of these changes. I'm too emotional. I'm too dramatic. I don't know what to say right. I need to make all of these changes. And then when I do stand up for myself, the emotional abuse just gets way worse. And so by the end of that 3 years, I was a mere shell of the feisty karate girl you would have met at 13, 14, 15 years old before I started to endure this abuse from these pillars in the martial arts community. Um, and so that was like kind of that next phase of wow, okay, now I am an adult, right? I'm 18 to 20 years old. Now I am responsible for my own decisions, but why am I still feeling like something's off and something's wrong? And I didn't have the language. Things like coercion, manipulation, those weren't words that were talked about in 2009. Like they weren't openly spoken.
Right.
Now I can look back. I have the language for what he was a narcissistic, abusive grandmaster who used his power and control. And I was such a, unique case for him because I was down here and this man, he controlled every aspect of my life. He controlled my romantic relationship, my career aspirations, my college schedule, even to the point where when I told him that I deserved a raise because I had done what he had asked, instead of giving me a raise, he had me print out all of my financial statements. And then every week he would highlight all of the purchases I made that I shouldn't have been making. So the abuse and the control was just outrageous at this age.
So I don't know if there was a season in media 5 years ago, 7 years ago, where there was a rash of exposés about yoga school communities and the few of them. This is like, like this is not an industry statement or anything, but there's a very, fine line between some of these like education communities and then what we would there's a crossover where a few of them, the people are nefarious and it can become a high control, cult-like religious situation. It sounds like the same thing can happen in the martial arts world, which is somebody should turn those into documentaries if they haven't already. All right. At what point, so you're in this situation again, I'm going to guess that you were playing a game with yourself, blaming yourself and taking too much responsibility. What have I done to cause this? At what point do you realize, at what point do you make a change or a decision? And what was it that you decided that got you off of this path?
So two things major happened. The first one was about 2.5 years in to this. The grandmaster had decided that me and his son were going to be engaged. So now I'm engaged. The son never proposed to me. Everyone's like planning our wedding. It came time for reviews. And during the review, I was told that I would not receive a raise because soon I would be married to his son. And once I was married to his son, we would commingle our funds and then I would start having babies. And so there was no reason to give me a raise. So the grandmaster actually gave my now fiance my raise. And I kind of lost my mind. I was incredibly upset. I argued. I was not letting it go. I went home and I told my now fiance, I'm not happy. I think I'm going to find another job. I still want to be a part of the school. I don't, maybe instructing isn't right for me. I'm going to find a different career and then I'll just help out when I can. But
Yeah.
this isn't okay. And the very next day, the grandmaster sent me to a different school for the day. They moved all of my fiance's stuff out of the apartment that we lived in, and his mom, the grandmaster's wife, my boyfriend's mom, met me at Denny's and she dumped me and she fired me and she sent me home to my hometown. And she told me that I had made this incredible mistake and everything they had done for me. She spent about an hour just belittling and berating me about how awful of a person I was. I believed every bit of it by that point, right? I had already spent 2 years just being completely inundated into all of this is my fault. If only I was better, I would be happier. I could do this job right. So I went home. A couple weeks later, about a month or two later, the grandmaster called me and decided that he wanted me back and his son was going to give me another chance. And so I went back down.
Oh, you went back.
I went back. I had truly in my mind thought, if only I can be better.
Yeah.
If I can do better, I could have my dreams come true. Because at that point, I still had the dream of opening my own martial arts school. So I was like, if I can please this grandmaster, right? In my mind, I thought I just need to do better. I just need to try harder. I just need to learn to, keep my opinions to myself and keep my mouth shut. And I went back and the abuse got incredibly worse, like it does when most people go back to a cult-like environment. And I was demoted. I was put under a brand new black belt who had no experience teaching. He was paid $6 more an hour than I was, but I was required to do all of the management work because I knew how to do it and he didn't. And anytime I tried to raise objections, I was just belittled and humiliated and beat down until I shut up about it. And it finally all came to a head when I found out about the pay discrepancy and that he was making so much more. And by this point, I had nothing to lose. I went into the grandmaster's office. I demanded to make the amount that this new instructor was making. And it was then that the bubble burst. The grandmaster looked me directly in my face. And he told me that I was never going to be a school owner. I was never going to be a martial arts instructor that way, that my job was to look pretty and sell contracts, and that I was to silently, submissively, and humbly support my future husband and his family goals. And if I couldn't get on board, we were going to have a big problem. And it was in that moment that I realized I was being trained to be the wife of a martial arts school owner, not to be an owner myself. That was the okay, I'm done.
Okay. And so this then is when you make a decision. You're like, I cannot be a part of this. And because the first exit you make was you were pushed out by your boyfriend's mom. At this point, do you exit on your own and make a decision like, I can't be a part of this?
No.
Oh my goodness. Really?
No, at this point, I had found out that that co-instructor had video or had recorded all of our conversations that we had had privately. He played them for the grandmaster, and we had talked about everything, including sex, and the grandmaster actually fired me for sexual harassment
Okay.
out of everything. And so then I was pushed out again by him. I was blackballed, and I was in a very, very bad mental state.
Oh my, is this where you end up in therapy?
No.
Okay. Okay, so you're fired at this point, you're unemployed. What are like, walk us through the bridge. Like, how old are you at this point?
It was 2 weeks before I turned 21 years old.
Oh my gosh, you're still so young. Okay. And you mentioned it wasn't until your 30s that you began to unpack this. Did you, all right, so you get fired. You think at this point that it's your fault. Do you go home to your family again? Like, what happens? What happens over those next 10 years that leads you to eventually making a choice to love yourself and heal?
So it was self-love was a long road. Self-deprivation, self-loathing, a lot
Okay.
of that came first. I went home 2 weeks before I graduated high school, or not graduated high school, I'm sorry, before 2 weeks before I turned 21. And then I called up my two best friends and we went out. I shotgunned a beer, bought a pack of cigarettes, and got a tattoo. And that I started a year-long party binge right
Okay.
before I turned 21. And then I met an incredibly abusive man, which we don't have to go into too much detail, but it is a part of the story. For 18 months, I spent my life in a very highly toxic and abusive relationship with not a martial artist, just a man who knew exactly what to say to a vulnerable woman. And the moment he had me dependent on him for my worth and my value, he began to physically abuse me. And then it was a physically abusive relationship.
Yeah, because
I finally,
you're repeating the same thing here with
it's a
different
cycle.
people. It's a cycle, and unfortunately, you're raising the stakes
Yeah.
every single round. So, do you know what happened? How old were you when you were either shown by somebody else or realized it for yourself that this was a cycle that you could make a different decision?
So it was after I left this abusive
Okay.
relationship that I realized that I was not ever going to date someone who I had recognized specific red flags in all three of these. I had just turned 23 when all of this went down. My abuser kicked my dog. He tried to kill me when I left, like most abusers do when a
Yeah.
woman tries to leave, right? That's the most dangerous time. And I beat the hell out of him. And, good for me. That was a win. And I fought for my life that night and I left and I realized I have to get my life together. I went and started college. I started to rebuild myself. I thought I could run from the trauma. I thought, you know what? I know exactly what I don't want in a relationship, so I'm never going to date somebody who treats me like that again. And I started to be very selective over any type of man I allowed in my life. So I went to college. I got a job. I started building my life back up. And then I met my now husband about a year and a half after being single. Still had no therapy. I just duct taped all of that trauma into a box and I put it in the recesses of my mind. And I was like, I'm never going to open this.
Yeah.
I have moved on. Um, we started dating, we took it really slow. We got engaged after a couple years. We spent another couple years engaged. I was always had an exit plan with this relationship. My husband really taught me what it was to be in a healthy relationship with healthy boundaries and healthy communication. And then when I turned 28, I got pregnant. And when I got pregnant, I went into a very severe depression.
Yeah.
And then I went into very severe postpartum depression. And all of that trauma and all of that fear and that feeling of inadequacy and being told all of those negative things for so long, it all reared its ugly head as my son was turning 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. I went to a therapist. That was the first time I went to therapy because I was very scared about the way that I was reacting to my child. Um, and the therapist told me to start writing in a journal, and in that journal, highlight in pink every time I felt angry. And within a month, I had filled the journal up with all anger entries. I was so angry and resentful that I didn't like the therapist. She told me I was depressed. I needed to go on Lexapro. I wasn't ready to go on any medication at that point. So I left that therapist and I started to deep dive. And this was where I made the real change in my life. I decided to quit smoking cigarettes. I decided that I was going to build this ideal version of myself into exactly who I wanted to be, what type of mother and wife and woman I wanted to be as a person. And I did that. I started going outside. I started taking my son to the park. I started really focusing on being a good mother and a good wife and a good woman. And that was when the real changes started to happen in my life. I walked away from a lot of very toxic friends. I walked away from toxic family members. I began to set boundaries in every aspect of my life. And that was when I developed my business, Pretty Hands, Hard Punches, too, because I realized that what I was missing and the reason I was so susceptible to abuse wasn't because I couldn't physically defend myself. It was because I didn't feel worth fighting for.
I think that is what what drew me to hearing this story, because it is like a very concrete and easy to see from the outside, like sort of contrast. It's like working so hard to be so fierce as a fighter, and then having this happen, which is it sounds like a very, very painful couple decades of growing up. And we all have our own versions of peeling back the layers of how are we different from the experiences we have as a kid. It's just that, in TV, we want it to be, stories of bake sales and honor society and not grooming and abuse. But you do come out of the other side. It's very interesting. And I do not know, I am not an expert and cannot do it, but that thing about making a new human being, it does bring up trauma for a lot of people. It's like you can be cruising along, pretending that you don't need to face it, and then you cross that bridge and you're like, oh, God, why do I need to think about my own childhood all the time? Okay. So okay, so then you make a change. You shift the emphasis of your martial arts training into pretty hands, hard punches. Why is this story important for you to share? Like, what is it that you hope that people will get from hearing your story of working through this and coming out on the other side?
I think it's incredibly important for women to realize that being physically able to defend yourself is only one small piece of self-defense, which I originally thought was all of self-defense. If I could fight you off, I could defend myself. But the reality is self-defense is truly about situational awareness, how you carry yourself, the boundaries you set in your life, and having the confidence to enforce those boundaries for people who are being disrespectful. And it is so important for me because although I was a sparring champion and although I am still very mean, I can physically fight very well. I still train. I have a gym in my garage. I still practice martial arts. I'm still all constantly training. But without the ability to set boundaries and recognize those red flags, as you can hear in my story, I still fell susceptible to very similar abuses. And that's because so many women don't realize it's not the red flags you're attracted to, it's the abuse you're comfortable with.
Yeah.
And most women fall into that cycle because they're like, oh, well, I have bad taste in men. And it's like, no, there's something that you have to heal from so that you recognize that you are worth more than dealing with the way this person is treating you. And so my whole business, what I thought it was going to be about, let me go to the park and teach these women how to break a nose or hit a dude in the throat if they're being attacked, really is all about here's how you set boundaries. Here's how you enforce those boundaries. Here's how you build that ideal version of yourself so you simply don't tolerate being treated that way. I always thought abusive relationships, they started abusive in the beginning, right? Like you go on the first date and he hits you.
Right.
But the reality is that's not how it starts at all. It starts by breaking down your self-worth and your self-confidence until you feel like it's your fault. And then once you feel like it's your fault, that's when the abuse gets bad. Because now your abuser can gaslight you into believing their version of your abuse. And when it's their version, it's your fault. And that's where real, true women's self-defense comes in. And we just don't see that in our society. When we think of self-defense as women, we're told to get a weapon, get
Right.
pepper spray, buy a gun. But the reality is 99.6% of women are ineffective using a weapon. So unless you're going to train with that weapon all the time, a weapon isn't going to do much for you. It's better to learn how to trust your gut, trust your intuition, and simply de-escalate or remove yourself from that situation so you don't have to fight back. And there's a lot of things we as women can do to recognize, oh, wow, this guy seems off. This is a red flag. This is I'm uncomfortable with. I always say the woman getting in the elevator. Like, how many women do we know that's gotten into an elevator even though they've been uncomfortable because they wanted to be considered polite and they didn't want to seem rude? But from a survival instinct, right, from a self-defense aspect, here we have a woman at a physical disadvantage, getting into a steel box
Yeah.
with a man that could be considered a predator, right? And what I like to teach and what I really emphasize is if you feel something is off, don't get in the Uber. Don't get in the elevator. Don't go in the stairway. Don't walk down the alley. Don't get into somebody's car. Don't take a drink from somebody because your body is giving you those survival instincts. And we're just simply not taught that when it comes to self-defense.
Those are all very good points. A couple of years ago, I was having a conversation with friends, not about this. We were talking about parking and parking lots, and we were talking about how some people back in, some people pull in nose first, right? Just how they park. And one of the people in the group was like, "Yeah, well, I back in because that way I can make a fast exit," which is fine. That's a valid reason. But I chuckled and I was like, that's interesting because I've like lived my life in such a way that I've never needed to make a fast exit from my parking spot, right? Yeah. I was like, not sure that either one of these is better. Like, admittedly, pulling out of the parking space is easier. But I was like, that's an interesting way to look at life. I get you there. All right. So that is very cool. All right. So you have two free things for the people who are listening to the audience who have heard this story and are resonating with it. One of them is a safety guide, and another is an ideal you worksheet. Both of the links for that are in the show notes so that people can connect with you and get those resources if this is something that resonates with them. Are you ready to wrap this up with my final questions?
Absolutely.
All
This was
right,
such a
let's
great
do it.
conversation.
It was. It was. So we were talking about some serious stuff. Okay, so here we go. Share something with the audience, Alicia, that is entertaining. This can be anything. It can be like I have a podcast. It can be somebody else's podcast. It could be a movie you've seen recently. It can be a good book. We have so much information all the time. Personal recommendations from people who are like us, I think, are great. So share with us something that we should check out that we might enjoy.
Absolutely. I have two things to share because they're two things that I'm very passionate about. One is if you're interested in hearing stories like mine, there is another podcast called the From Now On podcast with Lisa Phillips. I was on there, I was a guest, and there are some incredible stories. I listened to all of them, and they are very uplifting. They talk about healing from the abuse, but they also go deep into what these people went through and how they healed from it. And then a book to read if you want to learn more about intuition and gut feelings is called The Gift of Fear by Gavin D. Becker. Great story. It really goes into how intuition can save you, and it's entertaining, but it's also incredibly insightful.
That's helpful. So intuition is a funny thing. So, like, because times have changed, right? But there's, we all grow up, or at least I grew up in a big city. I was trained like not to walk down an alley by myself, watch out for long hallways, like I had that spidey sense, of places that I was trained to do. Fast forward, I'm in my 30s. I've got two young kids in a double stroller. I take the train into, like, I think it's Penn Station, and I have to find an elevator because I've got this double stroller with these two little kids, right? And I'm following the signs and I'm going down this like dark hallway, and I like look around and I'm by myself, and the kids are fine, but it's like I was hearing like the horror music like in my head. I was like, this is it. This is how I die. This is the end of my like this is but I didn't have a choice. I was like, all right, I have to get to the elevator. Like, what am I going to do? Anyway, it turned out to be nothing. Like, I went down there. It was me, some porters, other people with wheelchairs and things like that. Like, so it was totally fine. But all of my spidey senses were off. I was like, this is not where I'm supposed to be, this dark hallway. Anyway, there we go. The next thing I'm going to ask you, here we go. My funny story about Penn Station. Okay. This is a section of the show that I use at the end. I call it unsupervised online shopping. What is something that you've purchased online that you think was pretty great and we should all know about it? This can literally be anything. It could be a water bottle, a bedroom set, a kitchen gadget, like something you've purchased that you think the world should know.
Now I'm stuck. I try not to purchase things online. I'm on like a no buy
Oh, you're on the no
adventure
buy.
right now.
Okay. This is a tough time to ask you this question. Are you in, we can modify it then. Are you in like one of the no buy communities where you do like where people are giving things away and doing stuff like that?
Yeah, I have looked into that, but I do actually I did buy a 4th of July dress off of Amazon.
Okay.
It's incredible, and we're having a big barbecue. It's going to be a big deal for the 4th of July weekend, and everyone is going American flag themed. And
Okay.
so I did splurge and I bought an American flag dress. It was a lot of fun. I'm excited to wear it.
There you go. An American flag dress to celebrate the 4th of July. I bet you that is very cool. Thank you very much for coming on the show today and sharing your experience and your story. It has been wonderful to meet you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed the show. Before I go, I want to encourage you to become a bigger part of the conversation. Please subscribe wherever you're listening or watching the show. That helps my stats. A request from the bottom of my indie creator heart is to please tell your friends about the show. That is the real way new people discover it. If you feel motivated, I would love it if you rated the show or wrote a review on whatever platform you are using. Please be sure to head over to imperfectadulting.com and sign up for the email community. I call this the Village. You'll get some free stuff right away, and you'll begin to get the weekly emails that I send. This includes the links for special offers from any guests on the show and cool stuff I put together for the community. There's a lot more going on than just this show, and the only way to find out is to get the emails. Plus, you're busy. You don't have time or desire to follow every single tidbit on social media, and you don't have to because I'm happy to send it to you. If you have a story you'd like to share with the audience, I have an open application for guests. Guess where you'll find it? That's right, on the website and in the emails. And that's a wrap for this episode. Until next time, remember that the journey is the destination. Ralph Waldo Emerson said that, not me. Well, until just now. I did just say it. But what I want you to hear today is that if your adulting journey isn't going the way you expected, that just may not mean you're lost. It may mean that you're just on your way. And now, the fine print. The Art of Imperfect Adulting podcast and streaming video show is a copyrighted work created and produced by Amy Stone and Amy Says So. The music was written and produced by Todd Thompson at Dharma Bomb Studios. All rights are reserved. Anything expressed on this show is offered as entertainment, and the views of the guests may not always represent the ideas and viewpoints of the host. That's me. Amy Stone does not intend to hold myself, herself out to provide professional advice or recommendations of any kind. In the end, you and you alone need to make those kinds of decisions based on your personal and individual situation, needs, circumstances, and comfort level. Yeah, it's a little weird for me to talk about myself in the third person, but you get the idea. This is Amy Stone, signing off.